Hey, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Watch Us Thrive podcast. This is your girl, Leanne. We have a special episode today. Every week, every guest that I feature is amazing, but this week in particular is super, super special because we have a male guest on the show. And I've had a few before. If you've been around here for a while and you've listened, I've definitely had some male guests come on and talk about their own experiences around mental health and trauma. So, whenever I'm able to have someone of the opposite sex come on and have these conversations that I'm so passionate about, I'm so here for it. So, I want to introduce you guys to Seth Gehle. Seth, thank you so much for being here today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate it. Anytime I get to tell my story and help anybody out, it's always an honor. So I appreciate it.
Yes, absolutely. So, for anyone who's meeting you for the first time, let's start off with an introduction about who you are and what you do.
A lot of things right now. My professional career is I'm an estimator for a commercial construction company, but I'm a combat veteran. I'm a aspiring motivational speaker. So I've kind of kicked off that career as of late. And by the end of the year, I will be a published author.
Yes, that is amazing. And thank you for your service. We respect what you've done for our country. And I don't want to call you an aspiring motivational speaker. You are. That's what you do, right? And especially with the journey and the story that you speak on, it's very profound. Trigger warning, we're going to put it out there now. It is a heavy conversation, but I appreciate someone who looks like you to have these uncomfortable conversations because you are paving the way for other men who have gone through trauma, who have gone through abuse, to find the strength within themselves to talk about the heavy shit that they've gone through. So I'm going to have you share your story of what you experienced. Let's start off with your upbringing. I know you dealt with things as a kid. So, as much or as little as you're comfortable with talking about, let's start off with that part of your life.
Yeah, so we can talk about whatever. None of it's going to bother me. Basically, it kind of starts off pretty quick. When I was 2 years old, I was about two. My father nearly killed my mom. So he stabbed her. They got into a fight. He ends up stabbing her behind the ear. So he went to prison for a long time for that. And I never knew him growing up, so I don't have any memories of growing up with my dad. The earliest memory I have of him is meeting him at like 7 years old, about 6 or 7, and that was in prison. So yeah, so like going to go meet dad for the first time that I can remember was that. We have pictures of me as a baby with him, but obviously I don't remember that. So yeah, that was my first like encounter with my dad. I was walking into the jail, going down this line of cubicles and seeing him and talking to him. By that point, like I said, I was about 6 or 7, and we had been raising ourselves for the most part because my mom was a single mother of three, and so she dated a lot of guys and that whole kind of situation. For the most part, we raised ourselves. We cooked our own food, we did our laundry, we cleaned the house, and because she had to work. As best as I can tell, she was doing a pretty good job, I would say, for probably the first like 5 or 6 years. And then things kind of started to probably take a turn as we got older. And I don't necessarily blame her for it. I know it was probably very hard to raise three kids by herself. I can definitely empathize with her on that. I think later in life, I would start to question whether or not I can actually agree or disagree with her decisions. But at this point, we were kind of raising ourselves. And because we were always with different babysitters, so when you grow up without a father, you're already at risk for different things. And so by the time I was 5, I had already been molested by a babysitter. I don't really remember a whole lot from that. That was just kind of, it's very distant memory. I think it was more of, he was like a teenage kid. He's like maybe 14, 15, 16, and I was 5. And so I think that was more of like me being in the bed with him and him kind of exposing himself to me and maybe touching a little bit. But it wasn't, I say it wasn't anything crazy. This is always crazy, not to diminish anybody's experiences, but that wasn't that bad in the grand scheme of things. And I don't really think that that bothers me then or now. Like I don't feel any sort of type of way about that. But as life would progress, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, my mom, she had met a guy and got hooked up on crack and cocaine. And so she became very abusive and very mean and aggressive. And this went on for a couple years. And at the same time, about 9, 10 years old, because of that lifestyle, the places we were living and the abuse at home and the lack of like love and care in the house, you start to look elsewhere for attention and love and things like that. So I would end up meeting a guy through a friend. So he was a friend of a friend, and He's this old man, and he was in his 30s when I met him. I think he might have been 29 or 30. And at 10 years old, he invited me to come up to his house and play video games. And as long as I was going with my friend, my mom was okay with it because my friend was about 5 years older than me. So it was me and this older kid going to this grown man's house, right? My mom was okay with it as long as I was with my older friend. For the sake of the story, I'll say his name's Jacob. It's a made up name, but for the sake of this, I'll say his name's Jacob. So me and Jacob would go up to this guy's house, and this guy, his name is Mondo. We called him Mondo, anyways. That was his nickname. We called him, and so we would go up to his house, and that guy knew that I didn't have a father. He knew I had a tough life at home. He knew all of the things. I loved playing video games. I loved pizza, pop, loved to cuss and listen to rock music, and it was like a kid's paradise. We went up there every weekend, played video games all night long. I don't think I ever slept for the first like month or two that I would go to his house, and I would go to his house basically every single weekend. If there's 52 weekends in a year, I would go 45 to 50 of those weekends. I mean, I was gone all the time at his house. And so after a few months, he began molesting me. The grooming process had taken its course. It took about probably 2, 3 months. And then he began to touch me, right? And then from there on out, for the next 5.5 years, it was just a constant. I would go to his house, play video games for a couple hours. Then I would go back in his bed with him and he would just molest me for hours on a Friday night and Saturday night. And then Sunday, he'd take me home. And this went on for until I was almost 15. And throughout all this process, Monday through Friday, I was living with my mom, right? So Monday through Friday, I'm going home to the abuse, the drugs, seeing crackheads and people that are so high off coke and crack coming in and out of my house, seeing people sleeping on my couch, like passed out, shaking because they're just so high, look like zombies. I mean, it was crazy. I was dealing with all that at home, and my bedroom sucked. I had a little thin little mattress I slept on, thin little blanket, and this is in Ohio in the winter. I had a hole in my ceiling up in the corner of my room that was like 4 feet wide, about 2 or 3 feet deep, and literally just you could see straight into the attic from my bedroom. So all of the elements, the weather, the rain, the snow, literally like it was freezing cold in my room. So it was a pretty miserable experience. By the time I was 10, 11 years old and being molested and dealing with that, I was already suicidal. Like I wanted to die all the time. I remember sitting in my window and I'd kind of look outside and I'm like, man, if I just fall just right, I'll be able to break my neck and die. If I just land on my head just right. And so I'd always have these thoughts. When I was 12 years old, my mom was taken away from me. She got into a fight with her boyfriend and she stabbed him. And so that was like a whole ordeal. It was a crazy day. But she was taken away from me. And I bounced around a few houses at 12 years old. I'm like living with random people, bouncing around, going to school the whole time. And I was still going to this guy's house. Like this guy just kept tabs on me, like where I was going. And I would still go to his house on the weekends. And so I left my mom when I was 12, and my grandparents would end up adopting me about 4 months later. They found me, so I went to live with them. I stayed with them. My sisters went back and lived with my mom at this point. I understand why, but that's like a whole nother conversation. But they went back and lived with her, and I got to my grandparents' house, and my grandparents knew that I had been molested when I was like 5. So when I told them I wanted to hang out with this guy because I would defend him, they were like, "Well, no, you don't need to hang out with this grown man. Like that's not okay." And so I continued to defend the guy, and they said, "Well, we need to meet him." So my grandparents meet him, and it just continues, right? He gets his foot in the door, and like most child predators, they're just extremely kind, friendly, strategic, calculated people. They know what they're doing. And so he came in the house and he won my grandparents over, and the abuse would continue. And by the time I was 13, he had raped me for the first time. And then this would continue on for the next couple of years. And when I was 15, I was almost 16 years old. I was about a month away from being 16. I was up at his house with a younger friend of mine. And this younger kid, I could see the grooming happening basically. I could see the guy starting to groom him. And truthfully, I kind of thought to myself, like, the audacity for you to groom this kid right in front of me, doing the same exact things you did to me, to him. Like, it blew my mind that it would be like me flirting with a girl right in front of my wife. I wasn't jealous, but I was just like, terrified of this kid. I was like, "Oh my god, like I can't let this happen." So the kid goes back in his bed one night, and that was the first time I ever remember him going back in his bed. And so I knew I needed to do something. So that weekend, I go home and I report him. I tell my grandparents what happened. Grandma breaks down. We go to the hospital. We do the rape kit and everything like that. What was kind of crazy about that weekend was that he had molested me as well, and I believe he raped me that weekend. I can't remember exactly, but I think he did. And based on how my experience went at the hospital, it's all this whole day was like this whole weekend was really crazy. So it's very hard for me to remember sometimes. But when we got to the hospital, the nurses were asking, "How are we going to be able to arrest him right now? Because to go and arrest him, you have to have some evidence. We can go and arrest him, but if we don't have something right now, like he's going to lawyer up, and it's going to turn into this big battle, right?" I tell this part of the story because I told the nurses, like, no, I've got his DNA on my body right now. At 15 years old, I knew that when I went home that weekend to not take a shower, don't change my clothes. So I walked around that whole day Sunday, kind of waiting to tell my grandparents, like in his filth, basically. I get to the hospital and I tell them that, and they're like, oh my God. So they were super proud of me. They tell me to take off all my clothes. They go test my clothes. They swab my body and they find his DNA in multiple places, right? And so cop goes up there and arrests the guy. They get him to confess to just a little bit that night. They get enough to put him away. Then like a month later I find out that he basically confessed or pled guilty to like 10 counts of whatever it was, which is really crazy. In Ohio, if you're 13 and under, it's rape. But if you're 14 and older, or it might be 12, it's either, I don't know, it's either 13 or 14. But nonetheless, they couldn't say that he raped me. They could only prove that he had sexual misconduct with a minor. So it wasn't that he had even sex with like a child or like a young boy, but it was just misconduct because of the laws and the legal system. Because I wasn't 13 or 14 years old, or at least we couldn't narrow down that timeline, right? I was certainly that age. I know I was about 12 or 13 the first time he raped me, but because we couldn't narrow down the timeline at the time, I mean, obviously, I was like kind of going through it. So they just took what they could and they gave him 10 years. And that was back in 2011. So, which means he would be free today, right? To do whatever the hell he wants to do in the world. And what makes it even more alarming is this guy ran a haunted house in his hometown. Every Halloween, 4,000 kids would come through his haunted house, and he'd be at the end giving candy away to all of these kids, right? And this was on like Main Street in Bluffton, Ohio, and just like a small little haunted house, and it was always the biggest thing every year. And I participated in it as long as I knew the guy for about 4 or 5 years, right? What's kind of crazy about him being free, if he'd have been free today, which he would be, he would have access to all these things. So, but fortunately enough, he died in 2019. He pled for parole or something like that, was denied, and then like a month or two later, died in prison. So yeah, justice served. He served his full sentence and then died. So I'm glad that he got that much of it out of it, anyways. But yeah, so I reported him, put him away. I stopped the cycle. When I reported him, the friend who had introduced me to the guy, Jacob, for the story, he actually was there as well, and he was also molested by the guy and raped by him many, many times, right? And so it was me and him against this guy, and it was a done deal. Like we had him, it was no big deal, we had him. But it's just crazy to think that this guy got 10 years for about 10 years of his own pleasure with two boys. And there's no telling how many before us or would have been after us. So I'm very glad that I was able to put the guy away and put an end to it, right? And when I did that, that was basically the end of my traumatic childhood experience from 5 years old, as early as I can remember being molested the first time, to going through the abuse, the drugs, the violence, to being molested and raped. And going through that, at 12, 13, 14, 15 years old. And then boom, report him. And I kind of moved on with my life after that. I didn't go through any therapy. I never harmed myself in high school or nothing like that. I was a straight A student the whole time. I was a perfect student. I graduated high school. I joined the army, served in the army for 8 years, been all over the world. Went to Afghanistan in 2019. That's when I found out that the guy had died. But I went to Afghanistan in 2019, came back from that, and then I got out of the army, and I've been in construction for the last 3 years now as a civilian. And as of the last probably 18 months, I've kind of kicked off writing my book and kicked off my speaking career.
What got you to the point that after going through everything that you went through, you felt like now is the time for me to speak on this? How did that journey look like for you?
Yeah, great question. So I've actually done quite a few speaking engagements telling my story, but I've never told the sexual abuse side of it. I've always been, I mean, nobody's known that. I just started talking about this about 3 months ago now. And yeah, and so nobody's known that part of my story. I mean, like a very less than 10 people, very, very close people to me. So I've always had a passion for telling my story to tell other people like you can survive and get through life and these kind of things. But in the last 3 months, actually about 3 months ago, I started listening to podcasts and I'm writing my book. And so I knew when my book came out, like everybody's going to know. And so I wanted to wait until my book was done. But as I was listening to a lot of these podcasts with just different people, I could feel myself healing by hearing somebody else's story. I'm like, wow, like these are the words that I've been looking for on how I felt. This is what my trauma feels like. This is what depression feels like. These are all these things that I couldn't put words to because I wasn't talking about it. And so when I realized that, I just was like, you know what? I'm just going to talk. I'm just going to say something now. And that, what I realized was that my story, my pain, my suffering is not about me. It's about everybody else that I can help. There's 7 billion people in this world. And statistically speaking, I mean, almost half of them have gone through what I've gone through. So if there's anybody that I can reach with my story and help them heal the way that I have, that's what I realized. And I was like, there's no reason for me to be embarrassed. Like there's no shame, there's no reason to be embarrassed. It is what it is. These things happen and it's all about what you do moving forward. And so that's what I'm doing.
Yes, I can relate to that so much. I just wanna say thank you so much for sharing your story in such a vulnerable way. It's not easy to listen to. It's not easy that you experienced that. And I just want to honor you and thank you so much for giving other people the opportunity to find the strength within themselves to maybe one day come on a podcast and share their own story, right? I think that's just, it's so healing when we come together and we have these types of conversations, which is why I started my podcast, right? My trauma looks very different from yours, but being a survivor of domestic violence and almost losing my life in a relationship, I survived that. And I've been able to turn that really ugly moment in my life into a beautiful platform where we're sitting down, we're having these healing conversations. And like you said, it's not for me, even though every time I have these types of conversations, I am healing myself. But just to know that there's someone out there who can see themselves in every single story, that is the purpose right there. So shout out to you, shout out to me, shout out to us creating these safe spaces and just doing the work that we need to have, especially when it comes to men. And that's why I'm so glad that you came on and you're talking about it because you're paving the way for men to feel like it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to talk about these ugly things and it's okay for me to heal from my shit. And I think the first step when it comes to healing is accepting it and then putting it out there for people to take in as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So I want to know, talk a little bit more about your book. It's called Strength Beyond the Shadows. And what's the message that you hope readers will receive after reading it? And what has writing your trauma out been like for you? What has the writing process been like?
Yeah, so the main message of the book is obviously to describe my stories in a little bit more detail, maybe, but then also just understanding how I overcame it and how I look at life now. Because a lot of people get trapped in multiple ways, whether it's the victim kind of mentality or they don't understand how to turn their trauma into something powerful, right? You don't have to talk about it. You don't have to do anything crazy. You don't have to be a speaker. You don't, it's not like the pressure of doing all that, but it's understanding that suffering, right? When you suffer and you go through hard times or pain, that generates or creates endurance. It makes you a more durable and enduring person. You can, the pain and suffering that you have felt in life makes you unique in a way that nobody else or very few people can relate to that. So because of the things that I've went through, the next thing that happens tomorrow is not a big deal. I've endured. I've suffered, and so I have endurance. I can handle a lot of things on my plate because of the pain and suffering that I've gone through. And with that, when you understand suffering and endurance, you start to develop a character about yourself, and anybody that you admire them for a reason, and there's something that they did, there's something that maybe they've gone through that's like, wow, like that guy or that girl is awesome. Well, why? Well, because they did this and this and this. So they've gone through the process, right? They've gone through the trials, the tribulations, the trauma, and they've endured it, and now they're this person who is inspiring others, and that's what character does. So that's my message, is to understand, that your suffering can build you into this character that can inspire hope, right? And provide hope for other people to survive and to keep pushing and to keep fighting. Um, and it's very tough. It's hard, but it's also understanding perspective of life. So in my life, I have a very unique perspective where I have seen, obviously the very dark parts of the world, but also being in the army and then traveling all around the world, I've seen some of the most beautiful places in the world. So I have a unique perspective there as well. I know what the good things look like. I know what the bad things look like, and so I'm able to kind of show people where you can take your life. And I just think that with perspective, you can be more grateful. You can have more gratitude, express more gratitude with your life if you understand what's going on in the world and what's going on next door or what's going on across the street or in the next neighborhood over. You can possess more gratitude and perspective and gratitude. You can use those two together to just be a stronger person emotionally, physically, and mentally. And the writing process has helped me digest all of this. The writing process has been so therapeutic. It's like incredible. I tell people now when people come to me, they're like, "Oh, I've got a crazy story too. You should hear mine." I'm like, Write it down." I just tell them, write it down. When I tell you my story, if I tell you the same story 10 times over, every time I might remember something or forget something. But if you write it down, I will usually, like, if we talk any part of my story a little bit deeper, I mean, I can describe it as detailed and visceral as you want it to be. It does not bother me anymore, but I think that those very visceral, hard details are really important in stories. For me, it really helps me like digest the feelings and the atmosphere and like the environment that I was in. And that's what you can do in writing because you can just go back, delete, rewrite, fix it, put the right words in there. And the writing process has been incredibly therapeutic for me. It's actually helped me remember a lot of things as I'm writing and journaling. I'm like, oh my God, like I forgot all about this. Like I can't believe that happened. So it's been an awesome journey.
Yeah. Wow, that's incredible. And I just commend you so much for finding the strength within yourself to really put it out there for people to take in, right? Now, I want to ask you this question just popped up in my head, and this is something that I ask a lot of survivors of trauma and abuse on. What are your thoughts around forgiveness when it comes to healing from the shit that you've gone through? Not necessarily having to forgive that person who hurt you, but what are your thoughts around is it important? Is it needed for us to really heal through what we've gone through?
That's a great question. I certainly don't forgive the guy who molested and raped me, right? Like, I don't really have much empathy or sympathy or forgiveness for him. But on the same token, I'm not pissed about it either. Like, I'm not mad at the situation. And I think that a lot of people who go through maybe what we've gone through, and this is kind of something I've realized in the last few months in this community, unfortunately, that we're a part of by association. I think a lot of people are so focused on the punishment. They want to see everybody punished. And while that is certainly a good thing, like the people who do bad things, they do need to be punished, yes. However, I will urge people to report. I know some people say you shouldn't do that. Well, I think it's important to report because you need to do it for you. And for me, I reported purely to save this kid, right? I wasn't even really worried about myself. I was reporting to help save this kid. And for basically 13, 14 years ago, that was, I have never healed. I've never gone through therapy. I've never done anything. And so that was the mistake that I made was that I reported for something else and I never took care of myself. When you talk about forgiveness, you've got to move on. You can't sit there and sulk and just let it tear you apart. You've got to move on. And so I don't know if forgiveness is the right word, but maybe just letting it go, right? Maybe forgiving yourself that it happened. Like it's okay. When you report nowadays, especially, it gives you access to therapy, it gives you access to crime victim services, things like that. But there's no sense in reporting and then being like, well, he walked away free. Because my guy got 10 years, right? The guy that raped me got 10 years in prison. He would be free today. And I could be pissed off about that. And I could be pissed off about the legal system. And I could let it ruin my everyday life. But instead, I choose to wake up and be happy. And I choose to do things that make me happy. I try not to be so negative about the situations. And so, like I said, in this space with these kind of people, as victims like yourself and me, we can't be so absorbed or just consumed with the punishment. We have to focus on listen, you need to talk because you need to heal. If that person gets 30 years or walks free and you never healed, what's the difference? This is about you, it's not about them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that you said that, it's a choice that you can make. You can either go one route or the other route, but I think it's so important for you to put yourself first. Know that accepting what you've gone through, like I said before, and then making the conscious choice to let's do something about it. Whether it's writing a book, whether it's journaling, whether it's going to therapy, there's so many ways for you to heal, and you're able to curate that to make it work for you. And I think it's so important. Like for me, when I think about my own journey, my first step of healing was when I told my best friend what happened that night. And it's because of her that I called 911. It's because of her that he's now in prison for what he did to me. I made the conscious choice to use my voice and speak up. And that right there is so powerful.
Yeah, you gotta put yourself first.
Absolutely. So I know you are a husband and a parent. So going through what you went through, how has that influenced your approach to parenting your children and also being a partner?
Yeah, so parenting has been probably the best thing that ever happened to me. I mean, my kids are just incredible. And I would say that I took actually a lot of things from my mom. My mom, being a single mother, we had to be very disciplined kids. We were raising ourselves, right? And so I try to instill a lot of that in my own children. They're soon to be 6 and 4. And they're probably the most respectful kids. They're just incredibly kind, respectful. They listen. I'm not the parent, I'll say, in Target with the kids screaming and crying and throwing shit. I don't mess with that. Like, my kids know in a heartbeat if they're screaming and crying, like, they will get corrected. And so that's one thing as a parent, I do instill the discipline in them for sure. But the difference between me and how my mom did it would be like, I will whoop my kids, but it's not like this abusive, like, beat down, close hand, beating the shit out of them. It's like a smack on the butt and say, "Hey, like, we don't do that. Daddy loves you. You know that daddy loves you, right?" And I give him a hug and say, "Hey, I'm trying to protect you, and this is why we do these things, right?" Versus as when I was a child, my mom would beat the shit out of me and then say, like, "Get the fuck out of here. Like, go to your fucking room." So I think you should definitely have some sort of plan to discipline your children and to show them and correct them and things like that. But it has to come through love and not emotion. Like, you can't be so emotional and yelling at them. So as a parent, I am so in tune with that because I don't want to be that parent who, because of my childhood, I beat my own children, right? And I'm not perfect. I've had my moments where I've kind of freaked out. And then as far as like being a partner or a husband, it's been hard. I mean, marriage is hard in the first place. But when I first met my wife, about 2 3 months into it, she's the first girl I've ever dated too. So before her, I never had a girlfriend per se. I mean, there's been girls I've been with, but never had a girlfriend. And so when I met her, we were about 3 months into dating, 2 or 3 months, and I kind of told her. I thought I told her more of my story. Apparently not. She knew that I had grew up in a bad place and that I was molested and things like that. So I told her, like, I am jacked up because of what I've gone through, and I'm working on it, and I'm sorry, but like, if you want to be with me, like, this is who I am, and like, I'm a little jacked up. And so what was kind of cool about that whole situation was I don't really think she ever flinched. I think she was just kind of like, okay. It wasn't a big deal. And so it was kind of cool to go through that with her. And then we got married quick. We only knew each other for 6 months. We got married. A year later, we had our daughter. A couple years later, I had our son. And now we're living in the Atlanta area in Georgia. And I have more things for my family now than I ever imagined I would ever have my entire life. And so she's been very supportive, especially in the last few months, writing this book and kind of telling my story. She listens to every one of my podcasts that comes out, and I do the same thing. I mean, I go back and listen to them as well. But she listens to all the shows. I tell people like she's everything that I'm not. So, which is like really cool to have because she's got mom and dad, she's got grandma and grandpa, she's got a real big family. I don't. I think that she is genuinely happy when she smiles, whereas for me, sometimes when I smile, it's like sometimes I feel empty. And you can see that in other people too. People who have got really bad trauma, it's almost like a sixth sense, right? When you run into somebody, it's like, okay, I got you. Like, yep, you're jacked up too. Me too. It's okay. And so with her, you don't get that, right? So it just feels whole. Her whole family's awesome. So me marrying her and getting into her family, definitely one of the best things that could happen to me. Like I said, she's got the whole package with her family, and that's one thing I never had. With that, The challenging parts of that is because I never had that, when I see it, sometimes it bothers me where it's like, man, I wish I would have had a dad like that. I wish I would have had mom like that. When I see my kids hanging out with, especially her dad, and I see that interaction, it sometimes it like I love it so much it makes me sick, because it's like, oh man, I wish I could have had that.
That's so real, and I appreciate you for sharing that. Shout out to your wifey for helping you heal, creating your own family, right? I love that. So, going through trauma and abuse, not every day is rainbows and butterflies, right? Like, this healing journey is lifelong. Never will I ever say that I'm 100% healed because there's always new layers and new shit that life throws at us. So, I want to know for you, being a survivor of trauma, what are some challenges that you still deal with to this day, and how do you maneuver through those dark moments that we all experience being survivors?
Yeah, so challenges, simply enough, like having a short temper, self doubt's one of the ones that I can't believe it creeps into my head. As confident as a person that I am, self doubt is real. Like, I mean, almost daily I show up to work and I think I'm going to get fired. For the last 3 years, I've been the number one performer at multiple companies, like not even close. And I still, every single day, I'm like, I'm going to lose my job. So self doubt's a real thing that I'm battling at the moment. And what I do is I kind of just tell myself, like, these guys hired you for a reason. They brought you here for a reason. They're not trying to fire you, they're not trying to get rid of you. And I will overanalyze a lot of conversations at work where I'm like, oh my God, I think something happened. So I kind of, what I do is I just have to take a breath and just like sit back and just like, hey, it's okay. And you take that self doubt and do some positive talk. And as corny or as cliche as that may sound, it freaking works. What I'll say about self talk is, and I'm guilty of this, is I'll call myself dumb. And I'm trying to fix this because if you wouldn't let anybody else say that to you or about you, then don't say it to yourself because it really does take a toll. And I'm speaking from experience, right? Some other challenges, like when one bad thing happened, like I don't think I could handle another traumatic event. Like just being truthful, I don't know if I could handle something really traumatic happening to me again. Like if that happens, somebody better call 911 because like I'm going to need some damn help. And when something bad happens and it kind of feels like when it rains it pours, or like for me for example, I'm writing a book, I'm trying to get my speaking career going, and some days I'm like I give up, like I can't do this anymore, like I'm just ready to quit. And on those days what I tell myself is when the water is getting deep and it's getting a little hard to swim or the mud's getting thick and your feet are getting heavy, life is going to test you before it rewards you. And the test is going to come, and it's going to be hard, and there's going to be that obstacle that's too big. Like I said, the water's too deep, the mud is too thick, your legs are tired, you're exhausted. You're right there. If you just keep going, you take another step or two, that's the reward is waiting for you on the other side. And so, like, no shit, 2 weeks ago I was in my car and I'm like about to break down and I'm just thinking to myself like, I can't catch a break, nobody's listening to me. And I sat there and I told myself, I'm like, this is it, like life is trying to test me right now, and I just have to keep moving. That's it, I just have to keep moving and keep going forward. And that's what I do with myself. It's a lot of self positive talk.
Yeah, that's so real. Y'all need to play that back whenever you're having your down moments and let that inspire you because I mean it's so real. There's days that like I can't even get out of bed because I just feel like shit, right? And it's so easy for you to stay in that darkness because we're so used to it, right? Like we're used to feeling sorry for ourselves, we're used to being the victim, we're used to that feeling, but it takes the strength within you to do that positive mindset shift and to just know that these moments don't last forever. Like that's something to remember too. Like this too shall pass. I actually have that on a rock right next to me that I found walking one day. And that's a good reminder, like when you're going through some shit, just know like it doesn't rain forever. Eventually the storm will go away and a beautiful rainbow will come out on the end. So,
Here's one thing I'll tell you too with the this too shall pass. I'm not a religious person, but I believe in the Bible, or there's another story possibly. They talk about good times too, right? And this too shall pass. So when your highs are high, your lows are low, like just keep yourself in check. Hey, this too will pass, right? When things are going good, this is going to come to an end eventually. How are you going to respond to that? So when you're doing great, that's great, but eventually it's going to end. So how are you going to respond?
absolutely. Absolutely. It's super important to check in with yourself constantly, right? All right, so we're getting close to the end, but I do want to get some advice from you for people who are listening who may have gone through similar experiences, or they're at this point that they want to do the shift that you did when it comes to turning your pain into your power. So, what are some steps that someone can take to begin that transformational journey?
So turning it into power, you have to process it first. So if you have not processed it, that's the first step. You got to talk about it. You got to find somebody to talk to. I'm not a therapist, but I would say any one of my friends can come and talk to me and I'll listen to them. My warning to you is that when you do talk to people, you have to go in there with an open mind that they don't know what to say. Especially with my story, most of the time when I tell my story, I'll say you're one of the first hosts that have kind of just stayed in line with me. Most of the time when I tell my story, they're just like, yeah, they need a second to process, like, wait, what just happened? So with me, I can't get offended when somebody doesn't know what to say. I have to understand, like, holy shit, like, how do you process that? So when you do start talking, understand that not everybody's going to have the answer. This you could have the most experienced therapist in the world. They may have to take a second, or they may have to hear your story 2 or 3 times before they can start to offer any insight. So when you do start processing it, just be patient and trust the process. And as far as turning it into power, that takes understanding how strong you are. And like I said, for me, I used to walk into rooms and think that I don't belong here. I walked into corporate 500 offices, everybody's suit and tied up, nice haircuts, like mom, and I can just tell like everybody's happy as hell. And I'm like, man, y'all never had a bad day, huh? And I would walk in a room like, man, like y'all don't know who I am and I don't belong here. And now I had to shift my mind to think to myself, you know what? Yeah, I did not have a father. And yeah, I went through all these things. I was raped and I grew up around drugs and I grew up on welfare and I grew up and I was bullied and I was all these things, but I'm still here with you right now. I try to tell people to don't try to prove people wrong, prove yourself right. Because eventually people are going to stop doubting you. And if your motivation is other people's doubt, like somebody's doubting you, and it's like, okay, doubt me, doubt me, doubt me, right? If that's your motivation, they're going to stop doubting you eventually. And they don't give a shit anymore, especially once you succeed. They're going to be like, all right, he's good. He did it. And then once they stop doubting you, where's your motivation now? Your motivation's gone because you don't have that outer force like driving you. So you have to when somebody does doubt you, yes, that can be used, but you also have to be ready to prove yourself right. When I walk into a room now, I know I'm the best. I know I'm smart. I know I can do anything. And I'm going to continue to prove that to myself. I'm not worried about what other people are thinking about me. And that's where a lot of that power comes from. It's just being who you are and your body and understanding your heart, your soul, your mind, what you align with, and being positive and confident in those things.
So good. I can see why you're a motivational speaker because you're giving me all the feel good vibes. You're making me big myself up in my head like, "Yeah, I am that bitch, okay? I do belong here."
That's right.
So, thank you so much for that. So, I wanna know, people reading your book, listening to this story, just learning more about you, what do you want the biggest takeaway to be for anyone who comes across your journey?
It's got to be when you get where you're going, don't forget where you came from. We've all been lost at some point in our lives. We've all been new at some point in our lives. We have all either experienced trauma or we will experience trauma. It is inevitable, it is going to happen. We will all suffer either intentionally and willfully or through the chance of life. These things are going to happen. Bad things are going to happen. Good things are going to happen. And when you're going through it, don't forget where you came from. When you're going through hard times, don't forget about the bullshit that you came through. I've already been through this shit. I've already been tested. My character is solid. I'm good. I'm straight. Like, I'm going to get through this shit because I've already been tested. And when you're going through something good, don't forget where you came from. Sit there and smell the damn roses. Pat yourself on the back and be like, dog, like I made it, man. I made it. I'll never forget the first time I ever went to a beach. I was in Clearwater, Florida. Clearwater, not a super fancy beach, but I remember being 21 and sitting out on this dock and watching the sunset. And I'm like thinking to myself, like, I made it. Like I made it. Like I don't know how many people get to see the sunset on the beach, but I made it. And I would go on to do so many more much better things in my life than seeing the sunset on Clearwater Beach. but I didn't forget to smell the roses. I think we're caught up in this life of being modest, and you can't pat yourself on the back because you're cocky and you're arrogant. And it's like, look, man, you got to love yourself. You got to love the things that you've gone through, the things that you've been through, and the places that you're at. I'm so proud of myself today. And that's what I want people to realize is don't forget where you came from, the good, the bad, the ugly, and pat yourself on the back. Smell the roses when you get there.
Yes, and it's made you who you are today. All of the ugly, all of the beautiful, like look at you now. And you're inspiring others to find that within themselves. So I just want to say thank you so much for coming on. Your energy is amazing. Your story is incredible. It's one that we need more men to be having. So thank you for paving the way and thank you for allowing us to feel seen in your own story. I want to know, since you're on the Watch Us Thrive podcast, my last question, what is your definition of thriving?
Yeah, thriving is growing, right? Thriving is that weed in the sidewalk that's climbing out the crack. It's growing, that's what it is. It's growing. Thriving to me is growing.
Yeah, I love that. Oh my God, you are incredible. I know people are going to want to read your book, follow you, hire you to speak at their events. So please plug that all in and any final words you want to leave with my audience.
Yeah, the easiest way to find me is Instagram is probably the most reliable source, which is just Go Beyond the Shadows, which is based off my book title, Strength Beyond the Shadows. So, yeah, Go Beyond the Shadows on Instagram. That's on YouTube as well. I do have a website, sethgehle.com, and my last name is Gehle. It's kind of weird. So, yeah, sethgehle.com, Go Beyond the Shadows. If you Google me, you'll find me. I have enough out there now that people can find me. Yeah, and if anybody has any questions, any support, just reach out. I'll always respond.
Yes. Again, thank you so much for the work that you're doing. You are changing lives by sharing your story. So I appreciate you for bravely coming on and having a beautiful conversation with me. I'm so excited for your book. We're going to link everything in the show notes. Go get it, go support. And please, y'all, continue to grow, thrive, heal, love yourself. Thank you so much, Seth. Such a pleasure to meet you.
Thank you. Thank you.